Okay, so I am a retired professor of chemistry. I taught at St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York, which is right close to the Canadian border, from '83 to 2006, and I specialized in environmental chemistry and toxicology, and in particular risk assessment. We will have a section on risk assessment later on, and it's important for you to understand what risk assessment is about. I spent the last 20 years researching the toxicity of fluoride, and I co-authored the book, The Case Against Fluoride, which was co-authored by two other people, a retired professor of physics, James Beck, MD, PhD, and a retired professor of biology, Spenning Miquelon, who got his doctorate at Oxford. So we had a retired professor of chemistry, physics, and biology writing this book. Thanks to my co-authors, this is understated, not overstated, and every science argument that we state is supported by references to the scientific literature. There are 80 pages of references. Shortly after this was written, in early 2011, I was invited to speak before the Ministry of Health, their bureaucrats. I was expecting 2 or 3, in actual fact there were 20 showed up, and they listened very attentively to what I said. And when I got to the end, I said, we've done everything you could expect 3 scientists to have done who are opposed to something. We've documented our arguments, we've referenced everything in the scientific literature. I said, now it's your turn. This is your practice. You're forcing this on the citizens of New Zealand. I expect you to get your civil servants to spend a few weeks or a few months going through this book and responding to every argument. You owe it to your citizens to have looked at both sides very carefully and addressed the arguments that we've raised. After 6 years of nothing, not one word in writing from these people. And yet the Minister of Health went on television a couple of years ago and chastised the opponents of fluoridation for misrepresenting the literature. Well, the time to challenge us on misrepresenting the literature was when I gave the book to them and they had the chance to read everything, and then just giving this blanket indictment on every opponent with no specifics. They could have gone to what they considered I was wrong or I misrepresented it. They didn't do that. So in this presentation, I'll explain first of all what is fluoridation. I suspect you all know that already. I will indicate that most countries don't fluoridate. I will talk about the better alternatives to fluoridation, which we've learned from those countries that don't fluoridate. I'm going to talk a little bit about the public relations spin that the promoters use instead of science. They can't produce much science, so it's all, massaging. Fluoridation, I'll explain why fluoridation is a poor medical practice, or rather why adding any medical treatment, any medicine to the drinking water is bad medical practice. And they haven't done it with anything else except fluoride, but if they were to do so, that would be equally bad. The evidence that fluoride can damage the brain, that's the heart of the information I want to share tonight, because I can't believe that any sane person would deliberately add to the drinking water, ostensibly to fight tooth decay, if it was going to damage children's brains. The evidence of benefit is surprisingly weak. I won't spend a lot of time on that because my book deals with it quite thoroughly. Then a summary of all the arguments, and that's it. So what is fluoridation? Fluoridation is the deliberate addition of a compound to the drinking water that releases free fluoride ions. And the reason we can talk about free fluoride ions is that when substances, ionic substances, go into water, the positive and the negative ions separate. The water separates them. And then for a chemist, a solution of, say, sodium fluoride is like having 2 chemicals, sodium ions and fluoride ions. They're separate. You can treat the chemistry separately. The purpose of this practice is to help fight tooth decay. The concentrations used around the world, 0.6 to 1.2 milligrams of fluoride per liter. And another way of saying that is parts per million. I'll quite often come back to parts per million, but you should be thinking we fluoridate at about 1 part per million. 1 part per million. Please note the difference between concentration and dose, because often the promoters will obscure this difference in a self-serving way. So concentration is measured in milligrams per liter, but dose is measured in milligrams per day, and that's what's going to hurt you, the number of milligrams you get. And to calculate dose, you take the concentration and multiply by the volume consumed. So for water, say the concentration is 1 milligram per liter. If you drank 1 liter, you get 1 milligram. If you drank 2 liters, you get 2 milligrams. 3 liters, you get 3 milligrams, and so on. And not only do you have to calculate that dose to see if there's going to be any harm, but you also have to add in the milligrams of fluoride that you get from other sources. The fluoride is in tea, in bones, mechanically deboned meat, bones in fish, pesticide residues, fertilizer residues on food, and of course dental products. There's a lot of sources today. Most countries don't fluoridate. Most of Europe, 97% of Europe does not fluoridate. Some started but then stopped. Some fluoridate their salt. France, Germany, Switzerland, and Austria fluoridate their salt. But the majority neither fluoridate their water nor their salt. Yet, according to the World Health Organization, the tooth decay in 12-year-olds, which the World Health Organization tracks this around the world, is coming down as fast in the non-fluoridated countries as the fluoridated ones, as this graph here shows. So this is time scale from the 1960s to the present, almost the present. These yellow, brown, orange, and red are the fluoridated countries, and the rest are non-fluoridated. And as I say, tooth decay in 12-year-olds is coming down as fast in the non-fluoridated as the fluoridated. There's no good explanation from the promoters as to why that's the case. And then if you look at today, there's very little difference between the tooth decay in 12-year-olds, whether they've grown up in a fluoridated or a non-fluoridated country. So let's go to two of those countries and look at the ways they fight tooth decay. They are Denmark. I'm going to look at Denmark, and I'm going to look at Scotland. Denmark has the NEXO program. Denmark has also got the lowest tooth decay rates in the world. It's never been fluoridated. It's never fluoridated its water, nor its salt. Sorry. Sometimes the slide you're looking at is lagging behind. Now, the NEXO method, you can find out more details of that from the internet, nexodent.com. And the name NEXO is after the community where the program began. It began in about 1980, so they have 30 years of experience with this program. The results were so dramatic, it spread now to other Danish cities. As I said, the program began in 1980. Here's a graph for 5-year-olds comparing NEXO, which is the light blue bar, and the dark blue is the rest of Denmark without NEXO. Starting in 82, 83, you can see at the beginning they were about the same. And in 84, 85, they're about the same. But then you see a dramatic decrease in the tooth decay rates in 5-year-olds for every succeeding year. Very successful. It's even more dramatic for 15-year-olds. So again, starting a little bit later now, because the kids had to grow up, you see NEXO was slightly more to begin with, but you see this dramatic decline in the tooth decay in NEXO. A few words about the program itself. It's based on individualized, non-operative caries treatment. Most of this is carried out not by dentists or even dental hygienists. It's people that are trained to brush teeth, to show people how to brush their teeth properly, control the plaque. And this begins with children at 8 months of age right the way through to 18, and it's based upon home visits. Home visits. And both parents and children are shown how to do the dental hygiene properly, plaque control, in home visits. And they're checked on each visit. that they measure the amount of plaque there so they know if there's improvement or the opposite. And if there's decline, then they shorten the time to the next visit. We're talking in terms of months. The aim is to maintain sound teeth using the fewest resources possible. Topical fluoride is given only, topical fluoride, toothpaste, is only given if they're not doing well enough. If there's an indication that the plaque control is not sufficient, if caries are beginning, then they give oral treatment with fluoride. But they never even consider getting the kids to swallow fluoride. No systemic treatment with fluoride, none. Even sealants are not used because they are considered less effective in proper plaque control. If fillings or other dental work is needed, it is provided in a timely manner. And this is the first time that dentists come onto the scene. You do everything you can to keep those dentists away, and then if they're needed, they're brought in very quickly. In Scotland, the big difference with Scotland and Denmark is Scotland is based upon school programs, not home visits. It's called the Child Smile program, which teaches toothbrushing in nursery schools. That the beginning is the same, teach people to brush their teeth properly. They also put a big emphasis on diet. They insist upon healthy snacks and drinks in school, get rid of that sugar crap. Provides dental health and dietary advice to both children and parents. Again, you work with both the children and the parents, so the parents are learning what they've got to make sure the kids do. And then again, like the Denmark program, they provide annual checkups and treatment if required, and then they use fluoride varnish applications. So the results in Scotland have been quite dramatic. For 4 to 6 year olds, the children without obvious dental decay, age 4 to 6, has risen from 42% in '96 to 67% in 2012. And for 10 to 12 year olds, it's even more impressive. They've gone from 53% in 2005 and 73% in 2013. And this is all information from the Scottish Information Service, similar government information. As far as cost savings are concerned, Glasgow researchers found that the scheme had reduced disease in 5-year-olds by more than half between 2001 and 2010. And so summarizing, in short, our kids need more brushing, more fruit and vegetables, less sugar. 1 year before the US Public Health Service endorsed fluoridation in the United States, that was 1950, mysteriously, because none of the trials had been completed by then, the sugar lobby said, we need to find a way to reduce tooth decay without reducing sugar consumption. And they have been behind the scenes, trust me, every step of the way, that the real beneficiary of fluoridation is the sugar lobby. And the real harm that fluoridation has caused is that because parents have taken their eye off the prize, we've got an epidemic of obesity. Less sugar means less tooth decay and less obesity. And less obesity means less diabetes and fewer heart attacks. In other words, if you educate to fight tooth decay, you're going to be also fighting obesity, and you're going to be saving your country millions, billions of dollars over the next few years. So it's a good investment to do it the right way. Now I want to show you some PR tactics. The following pictures, believe it or not, were provided on a postcard sent to all the members of the Queensland Parliament by Queensland Health. These are civil servants working for the public. These postcards were sent the day before they voted for mandatory fluoridation in Queensland. So watch out, they'll probably use the same tactic here. So on this postcard there was this picture. This is what teeth look like that are exposed to fluoridated water. And this is what teeth look like when they're not exposed to fluoridated water. Well, your teeth have not been exposed to fluoridated water if you've been living in Christchurch. Is that what your teeth look like? Is that what your children's teeth look like? This is utter nonsense. Utter nonsense. But this is the postcard, as I said, the day before the vote that all the parliamentarians got. This is an absolute scam. So I want to tell you what this picture really is. This picture is baby bottle tooth decay. This is what's caused when a baby sucks on sugared water, fruit juice, milk, Coca-Cola even, for hours on end, and it rots the milk teeth, the first teeth, to the gums. But notice something, because you can tell when you're being scammed by the officials. Because look at the bottom teeth. The bottom teeth are hardly touched. And that's because in the sucking of this bottle, the tongue protects the bottom teeth. Now here's the point. There is no difference between the rate of baby bottle tooth decay in fluoridated and non-fluoridated communities. Fluoride cannot stop that. But where the big difference is between baby bottle tooth decay in communities is between rich communities or middle-income communities and poor communities. That's where the difference is. Now, there's no question that low-income families need better help than they're getting. But it's education that they need, not fluoridation. And when we talk about the dramatic reduction in costs in Scotland, it's probably because fewer young children need anesthetics to remove these stumps of teeth. You know, the promoters go on all the time about how many operations are taking place with anesthetics around this country and give you the impression it's because they're not fluoridated. But the real reason is this, baby bottle tooth decay. So, and if you have an educational program, that's your best shot of educating parents not to do this, not to allow this to happen. Here's another example of a civil servant using this propaganda technique. This is from Canada. Wouldn't you trust this lady, this lovely lady here? She's probably getting about $300,000 a year salary, and to make sure she keeps getting that salary, she has to do the bidding of Health Canada that's promoting fluoridation. So she has to hold up these pictures in public to try to trick people into believing that's what you avoid with fluoridation. Now the point is this, these kind of tactics would not be necessary if the science was on the promoter's side. If they could produce science which was convincing that swallowing fluoride reduces tooth decay, that's what they should be doing. If they could provide the science which showed that this practice was safe, that's what they should be doing. And that is why after 6 years, they've got no response to my book. And that's why proponents will seldom debate me on a public platform, because they simply don't have the science. They certainly don't have the courage of their convictions. But I think they don't have the courage of their convictions because they just don't have the science on their side. And so they have to pay public relations companies to produce crap like that. Fluoridation is a poor medical practice. Why do I say that? Well, we add a lot of chemicals to the water, but this is the only one in which we are using the public water supply to deliver the chemical, to deliver the drug. We're not treating the water, we're treating people and using the water supply to deliver the medicine. And what a clumsy way to deliver medicine, which is why, since fluoridation began, we haven't done this with any other drug. Even though there's some crazy people out there that want to add lithium to the drinking water to reduce suicides and statins to the water to reduce something else. And then the reason that we haven't done it with everything else is this is a clumsy form of medicine. If you put the drug into the water, you can't control the dose because you can't control how much water people drank. As I said at the beginning, it depends how much water you get as to what quantity of water, as to what dose you get. Secondly, you can't control who it goes to. It goes to everybody. It goes to babies, it goes to elderly people, it goes to people with no teeth, it goes to people that are sick, it goes to people with poor nutrition, it goes to people who have poor kidney function and cannot get rid of the fluoride as effectively as the rest of us. And finally, the most important reason for many people, it violates the individual's right to informed consent to medication. So what we've got here is a government doing to everyone in a community what not one single doctor in that community can do. force somebody to take a medicine without their informed consent. You can't do it. The doctor is required to talk about the benefits and the risks, and you as the individual should have the right to decide whether you're going to go with the medicine or not. Actually, it happened with me recently. I decided I did not want statins, but the doctors were really adamant that this was good, but they didn't force me to do it. Yeah, but oh, well, anyway. So here's another extraordinary fact. There's so many extraordinary facts in this, it's mind-boggling. The US Food and Drug Administration has never approved fluoridation. It's never even approved the use of fluoride tablets. According to the FDA, fluoride is an unapproved drug. I mean, what a situation. We've got unqualified people delivering to thousands, millions of people a drug that has not been approved by the Food and Drug Administration. The chemicals used to fluoridate are not pharmaceutical grade. They're not the same grade as in toothpaste and other dental products. Believe it or not, not many people believe this, but they're taken from the scrubbing liquor of the phosphate fertilizer industry. For about 100 years, the phosphate industry put out two pollutants, hydrogen fluoride. You can tell when that's around because your glass gets etched as near a phosphate plant in this town. Hydrogen fluoride and silicon tetrafluoride. Those are both highly toxic gases, and around the plants, they decimated the foliage, they crippled cattle, and eventually they were required to put a scrubbing system on to absorb these gases. Oh, it's quite simple. They just use a spray of water, and that silicon tetrafluoride and the hydrogen fluoride dissolve in the water and form a solution of hexafluorosilicic acid. Don't worry about the name. Now, they can't dump that stuff into the sea by international law. They can't dump it locally because it's too darn concentrated. But one of the vagaries of hazardous waste regulations is that if somebody buys hazardous waste from the chemical industry, it's no longer classified as a hazardous waste. It becomes a product. And without further treatment, this scrubbing liquor is put directly into the public water supply. And the only defense for this atrocity is that they argue that when you've diluted this scrubbing liquor by 180,000 to 1, all the pollutants, all the contaminants are so dilute that you have nothing to worry about. But one of the contaminants there is uranium. This same rock is mined for uranium, at least in Florida. And I don't know what dilution you need to do to take care of radionuclides. Promoters claim that fluoridation must be safe because fluoride is found naturally in some water supplies. But just because something is found naturally doesn't make it safe. Arsenic is found naturally in some water supplies, but it doesn't make it safe to drink. We're spending a fortune in some states in the USA taking it out. But I love the play on naturally. This is a public relations again. We want to make it sound like nature. In fact, the Australian Dental Association said, nature thought of it first. Baloney! They're confusing geology and biology. Geology came first, the rocks came first. Long after the rocks were formed, then life began to emerge from the sea. That's nature. So what is nature's verdict on fluoride? Not what geology, that's the vagaries of what rocks the water flow through. That's no verdict from nature. But nature has made a verdict. Here we are. The level found in mother's milk after millions of years of evolution, so it's been tested very well, is extremely low. It's 0.004 parts per million, and if you compare it with the range here, that means a bottle-fed baby in which the parent makes up solid formula with tap water is going to give their baby 200 times, approximately 200 times more fluoride than nature intended. So that is reckless in my view. Mother's milk is protecting the newborn baby from fluoride. Water fluoridation removes that protection. That is such an important fact. If you could just remember those two sentences. Mother's milk protects the baby from fluoride. Water fluoridation removes that protection. Bottle-fed baby gets over the safe level. A bottle-fed baby gets over the safe level of fluoride. There is no evidence that fluoride is an essential nutrient. Sometimes the promoters will say this, but they're wrong. In order to demonstrate that a substance is an essential nutrient, you have to starve the animal of fluoride, no fluoride in its food, no fluoride in its water, and then demonstrate that a disease accrues. They've never done that for fluoride. If you did it for vitamin C, the animal would get scurvy. And dental disease is not caused by a lack of fluoride. You can have perfectly good teeth without fluoride. It's caused by too much sugar and not enough dental hygiene. In fact, in mammals, you cannot find a single biological process in the body that needs fluoride. As far as teeth are concerned, the reaction is topical. It works on the outside of the tooth. It's an inorganic reaction between the fluoride ion and the mineral that makes up the tooth. Again, nothing to do with biology. But even though we can't find any uses for fluoride in the body, we can certainly find many biochemical molecules and processes which are harmed by fluoride. Doesn't do any good, but it can cause harm. Fluoride inhibits enzymes. The first opponents of fluoridation were enzyme chemists, were biochemists who used fluoride in their experiments. More recently, they've shown that fluoride interferes with G proteins, which are involved in taking messages across every single membrane in the body. That is very serious. If you're interested in the science of this, there's a very, very good article by Barbier and others from 2010, which goes into the molecular mechanisms of fluoride's toxicity. It's mind-boggling. If you look at some of the different places there, fluoride can mess things up. In this essence, fluoride is incompatible with our biochemistry. It's incompatible. And nature was darn clever to make sure the baby wasn't exposed to it. One of the big things that I'm concerned about is fluoride's potential to damage the brain. This is what Arvid Carlsson said in 1978. He was the scientist who led the anti-fluoridation campaign in Sweden, successful campaign. And this is an excerpt from one of the papers he wrote at that time. He said, one wonders what an increase in the exposure to fluoride, such as occurs in bottle-fed infants, may mean for the development of the brain and other organs, 1978. He won the Nobel Prize in 2000. He's a pharmacologist. He's on record as saying that fluoridation is a violation of every known pharmacological ethic. The notion of giving the same dose to everybody every day of their lives. This is what the National Research Council said in 2006. They did a whole chapter on the brain in a 500-page review of fluoride's toxicity. It is apparent that fluorides have the ability to interfere with the functions of the brain. Now, if you go to our webpage, fluoridaction.net, you'll find a little button at the top-hand corner called Researchers, and that will take you eventually to a health database on 14 different tissues: brain, bone, teeth, kidney, and so on. And my son, who made this database, incredible piece of work. It's the largest database in the world. This is done by citizens, and we've done more than governments on this issue in terms of tracking health effects. But if you change that last word on that URL, you could put bone, you could put kidney, any tissue you can think of, put there. You'll probably find there's a whole database. Anyway, if you do that for the brain, you'll find that there are over 300 animal and human studies which indicate that fluoride has the potential to damage the brain. And I look at this in several categories. There are over 100 animal studies which pinpoint where the fluoride goes to in the brain, what kind of things it interferes with, like neurotransmitters, neuroreceptors, enzymes, membranes, and so on. There's 34 out of 36 animal studies show that rodents exposed to fluoride have a decreased ability to learn. The way they do this is they put animals in mazes, like T mazes, Y mazes, water mazes, and the animal gets a choice. If it goes left, it doesn't get the food. If it goes right, it gets the food. So you do this a few times so it learns which way you go to get the food. Animals exposed to fluoride are less able to do that. 50 out of 57 human studies link fluoride exposure to lowered IQ. And there are 12 studies which have shown other cognitive effects damaged by fluoride. And 3 human studies which shows that fluoride impacts the fetal brain, the human fetal brain. So, I'm going to look at one of these in particular. This is, I think, the most important of the IQ studies. I know Zhang personally. He invited me to go to the 2 villages where this study was done. He compared the IQ in these 2 villages. Now, one village was the low fluoride village. The average fluoride in the well water was 0.36 parts per million, 0.36. And the high fluoride village, the average fluoride in the well water was 2.5. So 0.36 versus 2.5. He controlled for lead exposure and iodine intake, and also retrospectively for arsenic. So none of these were factors to explain what happened. He found a drop in IQ from 5 to 10 IQ points across the whole age range, and he found the IQ curve was shifted over. So the dark blue curve is the low fluoride village, the magenta curve is the high fluoride village. And you notice when you do this, you get fewer children in the very bright category, an IQ above 130, and more children in the mentally handicapped region, which is less than 70. Now, he did something which is extremely important, which not many of the other studies have done, and that is he subdivided the high fluoride village, the population in the high fluoride village, which was Waimea, into 5 groups, A, B, C, D, E, with ascending concentration of fluoride. So the lowest one was 0.75 parts per million, and then 1.5, and then 2.5, 3 point something, 4 point something. And over here, he looked at the mean IQ of these children in these 5 groups. Well, if you look at the first one, there may be a drop of nearly 1 IQ point, but it's not statistically significant. But when you go to a 1.5 parts per million, you get a drop of 5 IQ points from control, and that is statistically significant. And then you go down 99, 95, 82, 89, 78. And if you plot that out as follows, you've got what looks like, and it's very important in epidemiology when you get this is a dose-response relationship. It seems to be a linear relationship. And from this, you can extrapolate and say that IQ was lowered in some children between 0.75 and 1.5. 0.75 and 1.5. And to put that into perspective, compare that to the range which we fluoridate around the world, 0.6 to 1.2. And don't forget, what we're comparing here is concentration, and we can't control the dose. So it's very clear that some children over here are actually getting more fluoride than children who have their IQ lowered. And to make that case even stronger is the fact that those children, those rural Chinese children, were not using fluoridated toothpaste, and they were not breastfed. Sorry, they weren't bottle fed, they were breastfed. So there are 2 places where many Kiwis and many American kids were actually getting more fluoride, much more fluoride, than these children in China. And so there really is no margin of safety here to protect our kids from fluoride in water. Now, what put the cat amongst the pigeons, in 2012, Choi et al., a team from Harvard, including Philippe Grandjean, who's one of the gurus on mercury neurotoxicity, published a study, a meta-analysis, where they looked at 27 studies. 27 studies which have the same methodology of comparing IQs in populations of children, 1 low fluoride, 1 high fluoride. This was published in one of the leading environmental health journals in the world, Environmental Health Perspectives. And what they found was that there were many weaknesses. There were many weaknesses in the methodology of these studies. In particular, they didn't feel there was enough information in many of these short papers. But what they also said was there was remarkable consistency even though these studies were done in 2 countries, 2 in Iran and 25 in China, even though they were done in different geographical areas all over China, even though they were done by different research teams at different times, they were remarkably consistent in their results. 26 out of the 27 studies showed a lowering of IQ, and the lowering was 7 IQ points. Now we move to politics. That's the science. Now the politics. The politics is that promoters have mistakenly claimed that the average IQ reduction was less than half of 1 IQ point. Now what happened here is they confused the drop in IQ of IQ points and a standard deviation. The drop in IQ was half a standard deviation. Not half an IQ point, half a standard deviation. And half a standard deviation in the IQ distribution is about 7 IQ points. Now this was corrected about 2 years ago. It's now 2016. That paper came out in 2012. There was this flurry of efforts by the promoters of fluoridation to demolish these studies. So you think by now they've corrected that mistake. In fact, we did. I mean, it was corrected in the media and so on. But apparently, when Professor Gluckman and Sir David Skegg, released a report in August 22nd of 2014, they made the same mistake. Now watch it carefully, read this carefully. Recently there have been a number of reports from China and other areas that have claimed an association between high water fluoride levels and minimally reduced intelligence, measured as IQ. In children, the claimed shift of less than 1 IQ point suggests that this is likely to be a measurement or statistical artifact of no functional significance. Now, of course, we jumped all over them when they put this down. Remember, these are very distinguished people, and this report was designed to facilitate mandatory fluoridation in New Zealand. So you'd think that we would be meticulous with their analysis. When we pointed this out to them, this is what they came back with. They changed the word from 1 IQ point to, before they had less than 1 IQ point, now they made it less than 1 standard deviation. They just changed that part. But what they didn't do was to change the conclusion based upon the number. So they have the same conclusion based that they had for a drop of half of 1 IQ point for 7 IQ points. In other words, they're saying now, that notice they don't tell you the IQ points. They talk about a standard deviation. Not many people in the population have any idea what they're talking about. Yeah. Okay. If they put 7 IQ points, you would understand. Yeah. Maybe. But to suggest that a drop in 7 IQ points is of no factual significance is a joke. It's a joke. Let me explain why. There's your typical normal distribution of IQ. If you were to shift the whole population over by half an IQ, five IQ points, you'd halve the number of geniuses in your society, you'd double the number of mentally handicapped. That would have a dramatic effect on the population of New Zealand, economically and socially. And if you think that any chemical that you're being exposed to is doing that, you get rid of it as soon as possible. Now, here's the problem with fluoridation. It isn't just administering a drug to an individual. You may or may not be hurt by it. But what they're doing is administering a substance to the whole population. So if there's any slight change, it's dramatic. And that's why you don't administer a medicine to the whole population. You have no control. It's absurd. Now, Gluckman and Skegg continue. The fluoride exposures in these studies were many, up to 20 times higher than any that are experienced in New Zealand and other community water fluoridation communities. This demonstrates they have no idea about toxicology or risk assessment. Let me explain why. When you're looking, this is the 20 of those studies that we have the concentrations. When you look at studies like this and you're trying to determine which one you're going to use for a risk assessment, you don't go to look at the highest concentration or the highest dose, you go for the lowest one. If you're protecting everyone in the community, it's the lowest dose which causes harm that you want to find, not the highest. The highest number means nothing. It's the lowest number that you're looking for. By the way, in terms of the average of all these results is less than 4 parts per million, which is less than the safe drinking water standard in the United States. So Gluckman and Skegg, as I mentioned, poor knowledge. I've mentioned that already. And they use the word exposure. Exposure is not equivalent to concentration. Exposures are based on computed dose measured in milligrams per day and must include also the other sources to get to total dose. Now, it's not as if the people that wrote this report were unaware of this. Let me show you a section in this report, probably not written by Skegg or Gluckman, but somebody did know. Look at the way they talk about what you need to do a risk assessment. By the way, they talk about a dose response curve. That's what I showed you with the IQ. But this, in humans, this requires epidemiological studies, which is what we're looking at here, the Zhang's and epidemiological. From such studies, a no observed adverse effect level, a NOEL, is derived from which a tolerable daily intake, TDI, reference dose is determined by applying safety margin of several orders of magnitude. Wait a minute. Let's have a look at this again. Remember what we found, a lowering of IQ between 0.75 and 1.5. Now, they said you need the no observable adverse effect level, a level which you see no effect. So you could say, well, then this is what we should use here, the no observable effect level, which would be 0.75 of a part per million in the water. But then you've got to convert that to a dose. But they did not identify, Skegg and Gluckman did not identify the lowest concentration, and they certainly didn't identify the NOEL. They did not convert this concentration into a dose. They did not calculate the total dose. They did not calculate a safe dose to protect whole populations. You need margins of safety. Now, the typical margin of safety that you use, a safety factor, if you've got harm in a small group of study people, to extrapolate what is safe in a whole population, simply you divide by 10. So if X milligrams is safe, or the lowest level that causes harm, then you divide by 10 to get a safe dose for everybody in the community. Because you've got to take into account the whole range of sensitivity, vulnerability in a large population. You can't assume that every child in New Zealand or America has the same susceptibility as 200 or 300 Chinese children. There are different ethnic groups, different genetics, different diets, different lifestyle. You've got to have a large factor. Now, if you go back to what they said several orders of magnitude. You needed to take the NOEL and apply several orders of magnitude. That's 10, 100, 1,000. That's orders of magnitude. You count in tens for orders of magnitude. But they didn't do anything. In other words, what they did was the back of an envelope risk assessment. They said, if you compare the concentrations in these Chinese villages, and we look at the highest concentration, and we compare with the concentrations we use in New Zealand, everything's honky-dory. That is their risk assessment. It's crude. They wouldn't have a chance of passing toxicology in an undergraduate college course if they produce crap like that. But these are Sir Richard Skegg and Sir Peter Gluckman. So they get away with it. It's utter nonsense to claim that the concentrations used were not relevant to New Zealand. Now this guy here, Dr. William Hersey, is a former senior scientist at the EPA, and his speciality is risk assessment. And when he took those Zhang figures and applied a standard risk assessment to them, he concluded that the safe reference dose, or the TDI, as they referred it here, tolerable daily intake, was so small you couldn't possibly support water fluoridation. In other words, what he found, the level, based upon the standard risk assessment, our kids are already getting those doses. They're already getting those doses from toothpaste and pesticides and goodness knows what else. So fluoridate, if you did a standard risk assessment, fluoride is out of the window. This is what Philip Grandjean said. He said, fluoride seems to fit in with lead and mercury and other poisons that cause chemical brain drain. Now, it's politics. Politics, politics, politics. Let me tell you exactly what's happening in the United States, because the United States twiddles the rest of the planet in their little fingers. In the United States, we have the Division of Water at the EPA. And when the National Research Council completed its review of the toxicology of fluoride, they said that the current safe drinking water standard is 4 parts per million. That is not protective of health. EPA, you must do a risk assessment and determine a new safe level. That was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, and they haven't done it. They haven't completed it. But they had a press conference in 2011 in which they announced that they had started this risk assessment. And they announced also that they wanted to find a safe level, but they also wanted to protect children's teeth. Now that is totally illegitimate. They should not have allowed any notion of the benefit of maybe the topical fluoride has to teeth to compromise a risk assessment which should be to determine what is the safe level. Not what is the safe level which is acceptable to the bloody fluoridation community, the fluoride lobby. No. So you can see the politics there. But then they also announced that they consider that severe dental fluorosis was the most sensitive endpoint. And if you protected the child from severe dental fluorosis, which is a nasty mottling of the teeth which covers the whole surface of the teeth in severe form, then you protect for every other tissue. Made their life very easy. Just have one endpoint, and they said that will protect every other tissue. But that again is nonsense, scientific nonsense. Why? Because in China we have thousands and thousands of children in China who have had their IQ lowered and they haven't got severe dental fluorosis. They may have moderate or mild or even very mild dental fluorosis. And we took this information to the EPA Water Division, to the head guy, and said, look at the data. You shouldn't be doing it for severe dental fluorosis. You should be doing it for lowered IQ. That was 2 years ago. Nothing. Nothing. So if they did it right, it would end fluoridation overnight. Literally end fluoridation overnight if they came back with a safe drinking water standard, which they'd have to set at 0. They'd have to set at 0. We cannot add any more fluoride to our children. So we got 2 or 3 corrupt people, or let's be charitable, dundering idiots at the EPA that is holding the rest of the world for ransom because they are bending over backwards to serve the interests of the fluoride lobby. That's politics. Politics. Now some good news. There is one agency in the United States which has reasonable, honest people involved. I know some of them. It's called the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, currently headed by Linda Birnbaum, who I work with very closely on dioxin. And I know she's honest, and I know she stands up to industrial pressure. So fingers crossed. They, last year, recommended to the National Toxicology Program review the literature on fluoride and neurotoxicity. And a few days ago, in July, literally a few days ago, they reported. Now there's some problems with the report, and we're going to have a conference call with them tomorrow over the phone. As I said, there are problems, but they have concluded that the animal studies indicating fluoride is neurotoxic in animals has low to moderate quality. It's low to moderate quality, these studies. The word moderate is very important here. So this could be the beginning of the end of fluoridation, because they've got to do more. This is just the animal studies. They've got to look at the human studies and everything else. And I've got a question. Would most people put a substance into the drinking water if there is moderate evidence that that substance is neurotoxic in animals, it causes brain damage in animals? I think if you think about it, nobody would. So a key question for promoters or proponents of fluoridation is this. What primary scientific studies, not self-serving government reviews like this Plunkett thing, not Plunkett, Gluckman and Skegg, those people were handpicked to deliver that message. Have you read that have convinced you that you can confidently ignore or dismiss all the evidence of fluoride's potential to damage the brain? Put it simply, we have over 300 red flags waving on this issue. Over 100 animal studies, IQ studies, learning behavior, etc. 300, those are red flags. And what have you got? What green flags have you got to offer that negates all those 300? How many studies do you have? Where are they? Have you read them? Are you confident that the studies that you've read negate all those 300? And if you can't, then you have to back off promoting this practice. You've got to be certain. If you're going to have a medical practice, a practice, which is going to force a substance, a medicine, on every human being in your community, you have to be certain that it works, that it's effective, and you have to be certain, or close to certain, that there's no harm involved. And how could you be certain with those great bank of stuff? And I've only just tackled one subject, neurotoxicity. I haven't talked about the bone, haven't talked about the thyroid gland, the pineal gland, and so on. A key question for citizens, and we have on billboards in the States, do you really want to drinking a neurotoxic chemical? And other potential for harm, just quickly, I can't spend too much time on this. Fluoride can damage bone and connective tissue. The first indication that fluoride has damaged the bone is pains in the joints, pains in the bone, stiffness of the joints, just like arthritis. The first symptoms of skeletal fluorosis are just like arthritis. We have millions of people with arthritis. Nobody is checking in any of the fluoridated countries as to if there's a relationship between how much fluoride you've been exposed to and arthritic symptoms. If you continue to absorb the fluoride, each day your kidney is able to get rid of about 50% of the fluoride that you ingest. The other 50% goes into the bones, largely into the bones and other calcifying tissues. So it's steadily increasing, it's cumulative, steadily increasing in your bones over a lifetime. And over a lifetime, what we're concerned about is this fluoride makes the bones harder, but it also makes the bones more brittle. And the epidemiological studies on this are mixed. Some studies have found an increase in hip fractures in the elderly, and others have found either no change or even a drop in hip fractures. But again, there's not enough checking going on here. We don't even have people checking the level of fluoride in our bones, so you can have meaningful epidemiological studies on bone levels. Next, fluoride lowers thyroid function. In the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, doctors in Argentina, France, and Germany used fluoride tablets to lower the activity of a patient with overactive thyroid gland. So fluoride is used to lower the activity of the thyroid gland. Now we have millions of people with hypothyroidism in this country and other countries, and nobody is joining the dots. No one is seeing if this epidemic of hypothyroidism in women in particular may be either caused by or exacerbated by fluoride exposure. Utterly irresponsible. Fluoride accumulates in the human pineal gland. The pineal gland is a little gland between the two hemispheres of the brain. It's not protected by the blood-brain barrier, so fluoride can go in. It has the highest perfusion rate of blood in any tissue except the kidney, so lots of fluoride go in. And thirdly, it's a calcifying tissue. And Jennifer Luke, a dentist in England, argued, my God, this is going to be like a magnet for fluoride. And sure enough, when she measured fluoride in the pineal glands of about 10 corpses in London hospitals, she found the levels of fluoride in the crystals, in the calcifying crystals that is in this pineal gland. It's gritty. If you get a pineal gland, it feels gritty because of this brain sand. And sure enough, the average in the pineal gland was, in the crystals was 9,000 parts per million, went up to 21,000 parts per million. So, and
excuse me, will that lower the serotonin level from the pineal gland as well?
Well, that's a good question, because the converting one of the amino acids to melatonin is a 4-stage process, and after the second stage is serotonin. So the pineal gland is making both serotonin and melatonin. And what she found is that in animals, the melatonin levels were reduced by fluoride exposure, and the animals reached puberty earlier, which is quite consistent. Melatonin is thought to be a biological clock. It's only produced at night in the pineal gland. And in children, the highest levels of melatonin are in the child before puberty. And as the levels of melatonin lower, there comes a point they signal the production of the sex hormones, and so the kid goes through puberty. Now, when she checked the literature, she thought that many other people would have studied this. Nobody else had. But she found that the second trial in the United States, which is done in Newburgh, New York, controlled Kingston, that the young girls in the fluoridated community were menstruating on average 5 months earlier than the young girls in Kingston, the non-fluoridated. And there is also an unrefuted study by Elise Bassett in Harvard that young boys exposed to fluoride in their 6th, 7th, and 8th years, which corresponds to mid-child growth spurt, so the bones are turning over fast, had a 5 to 7-fold increased risk of succumbing to osteosarcoma by the age of 20. And that was a unique study. This is the only study which has looked at the timing of exposure to fluoride. The timing. It's exquisitely, according to her study, it's exquisitely sensitive to timing. The proponents say that a study by Kim and others in 2011 negated this study. Bullshit. They did not negate the study, nor could they, because their biometric for exposure was fluoride bone levels. Well, it's not like rings in a tree. They measured the bone levels at autopsy or biopsy when the kid was diagnosed. There's no way of knowing from those numbers what the kid was exposed to in their 6th, 7th, and 8th years. So this study by Bassett has never been refuted. And nobody else has checked the timing of when the kids are exposed. The evidence of effectiveness is surprisingly weak. We spend 3 chapters in my book on this, chapters 6 through 8. I urge you to look at those. The incredible thing is that after 70 years, these promoters, remember, this is their practice. It's not my practice. It's not your practice. It's their practice. The dental lobby. They have not got their act together to do a randomized control trial on an individual basis. Difficult to do an RCT on a community basis. But on an individual basis, you could. You could randomizely select children. And without knowing which is which, you could give some children bottles with fluoride at 1 part per million, and the others you give it without fluoride in it. And after doing this every day for a few years, you find out the tooth decay. And you should be able to show that the tooth decay for those exposed to fluoride was lower than the kids that weren't. That's the way you would do it scientifically. That is the gold standard for epidemiology. That's what the FDA would have required if politics had allowed them to do the kind of tests that they do for drugs. If you're going to get a drug approved, you'd have to go through a randomized control trial, both for safety and for effectiveness. But to conclude the story, there's a lot of other evidence, but I bring you up to date with the latest. In June of 2015, the Cochrane collaboration reviewed the effectiveness of fluoridation, or the studies which purported to show. Now, the Cochrane collaboration is acknowledged internationally as the gold standard for evidence-based reviews of health science. This is the top of the top. If you are interested in science-based medicine, you go to the Cochrane review. Well, they looked at the effectiveness of fluoridation, and this is what they concluded. The authors said there was no high-quality research that showed that it provided any benefit to adults, contrary to what you're told in the Gluckman report. It provided additional benefits over topical treatment, which is what you're told in the Gluckman and Skegg report. That it reduced inequalities among children from different socioeconomic groups. Contrary, it did not. They don't have high quality studies for them, and that's contrary again to the Gluckman report. And finally, tooth decay did not. They didn't have good studies which showed that tooth decay went up when communities stopped fluoridation. Again, contrary to the Gluckman and Skegg report. So the Cochrane collaboration does not make Gluckman and Skegg's analysis look very good. Finally, they also concluded that although there was some studies on a historical level that showed that fluoride lowered tooth decay, this is what they said in children. As far as those studies, they questioned whether they were applicable to today's society, as nearly all the studies reviewed were pretty old. They dated back to the 40s and 60s, and their words had a high risk of bias and were conducted prior to the availability of fluoride toothpaste and other sources of fluoride which we have today. In other words, bottom line, the studies that are supposed to show that fluoridation work are not relevant to today's society. Now, the probable explanation for this strange finding is certainly strange to me, because when I got involved with this, I thought we were going to find a lot of health concerns which would negate the notion of the benefit to teeth. That the benefit to teeth might be there, but would it be worth it if you lowered children's intelligence? But surprisingly, what we found is that the evidence was extremely weak. And there's a rational explanation for this. For many, many years, the proponents of fluoridation thought that the mechanism of fluoride's protection of the teeth occurred before the teeth had erupted. That's why they gave tablets to pregnant women. And babies, when they were born, got drops. The idea being that you loaded up the enamel whilst the teeth were still under the gums, and then when they erupted into the mouth, that fluoride would protect the enamel, this early enamel, from the acid attack from sugars being broken down. But then in 1999, this is what the Center of Disease Control, the big proponent of fluoridation in the States, said. Laboratory, that they have the previous few sentences, we used to think, and then they continued, but laboratory and epidemiologic research suggests that fluoride prevents dental caries predominantly after eruption of the tooth into the mouth, and its actions primarily are topical. And here's some logic. Can you take it? If fluoride works primarily on the outside of the tooth, why swallow it? It's like swallowing boot polish. It's like chewing on condoms for safe sex. Why expose every tissue of the body to a known toxic substance when you can brush it on your teeth and spit it out? I should say, I'm not advocating fluoridated toothpaste, by the way. I haven't used it for 20 years. But I certainly don't think you should be swallowing it with every glass of water that you drink. And why put it into the water, the drinking water, and force it onto people who don't want it? Fluoridation should have ended in 1999 when the CDC said that. So summarizing the arguments against fluoridation, number one, it's unusual. Most countries don't do it. It's unnatural. Nature did not provide much, very, very little fluoride for babies. It's unethical. The government has no right to force it upon us against our informed consent. It's unsafe. Particularly, I've shown you the evidence for the brain, but there are other tissues. It's unnecessary. If you want fluoride, you can simply brush it on your teeth and spit it out. And at the very least, fluoridation is a gross violation of the precautionary principle. If there's any doubt, leave it out. And other countries have demonstrated that there are other and better ways of fighting tooth decay without forcing fluoridation on the whole population. These other ways are not only better for teeth, but they're better for health, fighting obesity. We need education, not fluoridation. Water fluoridation is an obsolete practice, and it is time to end it in New Zealand, and certainly not make it mandatory. And there are some resources to back this all up. First of all, the National Research Council report, 500 pages, 1,100 references, is now the Bible of toxicology on fluoride. It's accessible free online, and it's searchable, by word search on the document. There's our book, which was designed partly to make this NRC report more accessible to the ordinary person using ordinary language. And you've got our webpage, which has the largest health database in the world. We have videos there. If you go to Fan TV at the top, you'll see many videotapes which you can watch and download for free. One of them is professional perspectives on water fluoridation. It's only 28 minutes long. That's 15 scientists from around the world explaining in simple terms why it's a bad practice. 10 facts on fluoride, that's my son's summary with a 10-page booklet to back it up. And an interview with Chris Bryson, the author of Fluoride Deception. And John Cahoon. Now, John Cahoon is one of my heroes and should be one of your heroes. Up until about 1980, John was Principal Dental Officer for Auckland. He was also a member of the Auckland Council, and in both positions he avidly promoted fluoridation around New Zealand. He was very effective, and his employees sent him on a world tour in 1980. He went to Asia, Australia, North America, and Europe, and he was trying to gather really good scientific information that fluoridation worked. And they said behind the scenes, John, we're not finding that information. We're not finding strong evidence that it works. Instead, they were telling him they couldn't find any difference between fluoridated communities and non-fluoridated communities. That was the beginning of the end of fluoridation in 1980. But it's taking a long time for the world to catch up to John Cahoon. And I must say, I've never interviewed anyone in my life who I was more impressed with this guy, John Cahoon. Softly spoken, no harsh words for the opponents, and yet he had the guts in public to change his position and spend the rest of his life trying to undo the damage he had caused. So a real hero in the Kiwi history here. And incidentally, one more thing, and then I'll shut up and you can ask questions. One more thing. After he retired from dentistry, he did a PhD at the University of Auckland. And his PhD is on the history of fluoridation. And we need to get that available to everybody, his thesis. And basically he argued that education is more effective than fluoridation at reducing tooth decay. And in that thesis, he showed that the first trial in New Zealand, which launched fluoridation, Hastings Napier, was a fraud. It was fraudulent. There's never been a rebuttal of that. If you can find one, send it to me. It was a fraud. I'll tell you very quickly how it's done, right? Hastings was going to be fluoridated. Napier was the control, not fluoridated. After 2 years, they dropped Napier as the control. So the study changed from not comparing tooth decay in Hastings and Napier after 10 years, but comparing tooth decay in Hastings at the beginning of the experiment and at the end of the experiment. Here's the fraud. They changed the diagnosis of what constituted tooth decay in between. So at the beginning of the experiment, tooth decay, the school dentists were filling indentations, not real cavities, indentations. But at the end of the experiment, they were not filling indentations. So the 60% drop that they claim is an artifact. It's an artifice of the method that they used. And what makes it fraud is that the authors, when they published this report, did not indicate that the methodology, the method of diagnosing tooth decay, had changed from beginning to end. And if I had time, I'd show you, but I could send it to you, a letter from G.H. Leslie, who was head of dentistry in New Zealand, who 8 years into the experiment complained they couldn't find the evidence. They couldn't find the evidence. They couldn't find the evidence to support the claim that fluoridation equals less fillings. That was 8 years into the experiment. 2 years later, magnificent report says 60% reduction, and fluoridation is launched throughout New Zealand. So it's fraud then, and it continues to be fraud today. Do not be fooled by the public relations crap that they keep putting out. Thank you.